As demonstrations over George Floyd's death continue around the world, the calls for justice include the names of others who have died in police custody, such as Freddie Gray. 5 years ago, Gray died from injuries he sustained in a Baltimore police van, sparking protests in that city and across the country. A new book tells the story of what happened during the most tumultuous days of the demonstrations through the eyes of 8 people. It's called 5 Days, The Fiery Reckoning of an American City. The book's author, Wes Moore, joins me now. He is also the CEO of the Robin Hood Foundation. Welcome, Wes. It's so great to have you with us. We really appreciate you being here. You know, for many people, blacks in particular, the death of George Floyd, it's a story that's been told before. I mean, in the stories of Freddie Gray, Breonna Taylor, Eric Garner, to name a few. In writing this book, how would you compare Freddie Gray's death to George Floyd's? How are they similar? How are they different?
Well, unfortunately, they are incredibly similar when you look at the situation that occurred. It's an African-American man who is in contact with police an hour after he is arrested. He's in a coma. A week after he's in a coma, he dies. And after his death, there's this whole series of protests that are triggered where people are demanding basic accountability because they want to know how exactly this happened. How exactly do you have a person who has contact with police and an hour later he's in a coma and no one is accountable for it? I think the thing and the hope is that the takeaway from this is going to be different than the takeaway that happened from Freddie Gray. Because, after you had these series of protests, very similar to Freddie Gray, very similar to many of the other names that we have called out, the meaningful reforms to the systemic challenges that exist within policing and the systemic racism that's placed into so many different segments of our society had not been addressed. And I think that's why you're continuing to see the energy around this that you're seeing now.
Well, let's dive in a little more into the systemic piece of it because, as we all know, this is a far more complicated issue than just police brutality, right? As you talk in your book about people mourning Freddie Gray's death, but that really we should have been mourning his life. Can you explain that?
Yeah, we, oftentimes the conversation really does delve into these two categories, right? Where it's either Freddie Gray was arrested on different occasions to the point that the police officers knew his name at the time of the final arrest, or it was just excessive police activity without understanding the damage that had happened to Freddie long before that final interaction with law enforcement, where we need to focus on and think about what does justice mean for Freddie in terms of his death. But let's take a moment and consider his life. Freddie Gray was born premature, months early, underweight, addicted to heroin because his mother never made it to high school and she battled addiction for much of her life. When Freddie Gray finally gained enough weight to leave the hospital, he moved into a housing project in West Baltimore that in 2009, that and 400 other homes were later named in a lawsuit for the endemic levels of lead inside of that housing project. So now you had someone who was born underweight, addicted to heroin, born premature, lead poisoned. And by that time in his life, Freddie Gray is 2 years old. And so this argument of, well, people in poverty need to work harder. How hard would Freddie had to have worked in order to combat things that he had no responsibility for? And that's what I wanted people to understand with these stories. We have to be able to address inequitable policing. It is real. It is not hyperbole. It is not exaggeration. We also have to address all the other injustices that are taking place within society if we're ever going to have a real conversation about what does it mean to create levels of opportunity inside of communities in this country.
So do you see that then as two separate struggles? In other words, as we combat the police inequity part of it, can we also then combat all the other societal inequities at the same time? Or do those battles look different?
I think we have no choice but to battle these things all at the same time. Because I think when people ask about what's the prioritization is life. The prioritization is justice. The prioritization is fairness. And so I don't know how we tier out what element of justice and what element of life gets a higher priority than the others. And so my push, my focus, my energy is going to go towards, do we need to have real sustainable adjustments to policing in this country? Absolutely. Do we also need to address the endemic levels of child poverty that we have in this country? Absolutely. Do we need to address the fact that we have massive health disparities that we have still not wrapped our arms around? Absolutely. When we're talking about packages that are being submitted about the ways we have to deal with this, the package must be full. It must be all-encompassing, because the way you are going to deal with a systemic breakdown is not by nibbling around individual edges. You address a systemic breakdown by fundamentally implementing a systemic buildup.
Wes Moore, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate your time. And the book, again, is called 5 Days, The Fiery Reckoning of an American City. It's on sale June 20th.